Michael Scott, Scotty Man Photo. Why use ND filters for landscape photography? That's a good question. But let me give you a quote by Ansel Adams. A great photograph is one that fully expresses what one feels, in the deepest sense, about what is being photographed. Let's get started. So one of the things I find is people tend to be a little confused over what types of filters are out there and what their purpose is. What are they for? So I thought I'd talk a little bit about different filters. I've got some laid out here. One that I use, I wouldn't say all the time, but sometimes, is a graduated neutral density filter. And as you can see, the kind of the harshness of it increases as it goes up to the top. And typically what this is for is when you have a bright highlight area and you just want to knock that down a little bit. And so typically I use this probably if the opportunity is there and I can use it, I do use it. And I'll tell you why here in a little bit. Some of the other filters, this is one that's kind of new. And again, I thank Glenn from Sniper Photography for introducing me to this one. I'd seen these but never really felt there was a need for them. And this is kind of a reverse ND filter, or reverse grad. And what it does is it's kind of darker in the center, as you can see. And what that'll do is that'll give you an opportunity to put that in your holder, and you can kind of move it up and down a little bit. But when you have, it's really ideal for sunsets and sunrises. And when you have that sun right on the horizon, it tends to be the brightest spot in the image. And this little guy can really help take the brightness down where the center of the sunrise or sunset is, and I really like these. Now there's a variety of neutral density filters, graduated neutral density filters that you can get, different strengths and different harshness. And these are soft grads. I really don't have any harsh grads. I think if I were photographing the ocean quite a bit like I used to, even then, honestly, I didn't use a hard grad. I used more of a soft grad, maybe a medium grad. And I think if there is an object in the frame, the softer edge is more forgiving. So you can kind of get away with that, where that harsh line, if you looked at it from here, that harsh line would really kind of mess up your image. So yeah, I prefer the softer grads. Some of the other filters that I think are super important are ND filters, and these are not graduated. These are just, this is a 3-stop, and then I've got, and you can kind of see that 3-stop. You can see through it, and this really just allows me to kind of slow down, slow motion a little bit, and get a little bit slower shutter speed. I mainly use that for waterfalls. And then this one, so I've got a 6 and a 10 stop in my bag, and I would say I use the 6 more than anything. And maybe on a brighter day, you can really kind of slow down that motion. And again, I mainly use these for water, some type of either a waterfall, or if I really want that ethereal look, maybe on a lake, and I've got a placid lake, but I really just want to make that water flat. And sometimes I like that look. In fact, a lot of people kind of like that ethereal look, and truly I'm one of them. So I don't like it always, but I want to have the option to capture that in camera, and that's why I have these filters here. A couple other filters in my bag, and I think these are just, this is a filter that you just can't live without, and at least I can't. This is a circular polarizer, and you can kind of see that, as you turn this, notice how the water shifts. You take the glare off the water. There's a million uses for this, and I think this is a super important filter to have in your bag. I also have a 77mm circular polarizer too. These just kind of twist. There's two panes of glass in there, and they just twist to increase the polarization effect or decrease it. And this is handy. I've got a lot of 77mm filters, lenses. But this one, this is a 14-24 Nikon. And I got to tell you, well, a lot of people complain about this, but I just find it's easy to stretch over the filter holder. But anyway, this thing's got a filter holder on it that's, it's pretty big. And you just attach the holder on it. But I found that having this 14-24, I don't want to have two filter sets. So I basically have one filter set. and I just mount these. I use adapters, 77mm adapters. I even have some smaller ones for my SLR so that I can use this filter holder. And I think that just allows me to not have to carry a dozen different filter holders. So yeah. So the uses of ND filters vary, but mainly I think the ND filter allows you to get a slower shutter speed so that you can have creative effects in your image, whether that's streaking water, streaking clouds, motion, and you can do that without the cost of stopping down the aperture, and which can create other things that aren't so desirable, like diffraction. You want to shoot your lens at the sweet spot, which is around f8 or f11 or whatever that sweet spot of your lens is. These filters give you the option to do just that without having the consequences of stopping down your aperture. And that's mainly why I use them. Some other things you can do with an ND filter is you can take very, very long exposures and in bright sunlight conditions, so probably up to around 15 stops. I mean, I guess I could put my 10 stop and maybe my 3 stop together, or my 10 and 6 together if I really wanted to slow motion down that much, but I don't think I've ever done that. It's usually either the 10 or the 6, and that's enough. But more often than not, I think I use a 3 to really get that look that I want in the water. But the long exposure can do some other things too. For example, taking a very long exposure of a busy scene can help to kind of remove people from the image. And I know you can do it in Photoshop too, and there's a million ways to do it. But and I honestly don't use ND filters much for that. But usually I'll take a couple of exposures if I've got maybe a person in one image and I don't want them there. I'll just wait till they move, and then I capture another image. You can kind of brush that person out. So there's ways around it. But anyway, having that ND filter to slow that motion, it just gives you options. So I mentioned the graduated neutral density filter earlier, and I want to talk a little bit more about that because there's a lot of discussion on whether these are needed or not. And long story short, yeah, you can replicate this in Lightroom or Photoshop, but there is an advantage to having this. And I think that goes to that creative process and being able to capture things in the field. And so for me, I think if I can take that exposure and take bright highlights and balance that out with a neutral density filter or graduated filter, then I would rather do that in camera than do that in Photoshop. Although, like I mentioned, I don't always do it, but I like having the option. So the real question is, do I need filters? Well, bottom line is, can these effects be reproduced in Photoshop and Lightroom? Yes. By and large, all of them can be reproduced in Lightroom or Photoshop. But the question is that your process? Is that, I mean, if you're on a tight budget, you want to save money, you could probably get away without doing filters. I would say, though, right off the bat, that, and I think the circular polarizer is in a different category, but that's one you just can't do without. I don't think there's a way to replicate the effects of a circular polarizer when used correctly. The circular polarizer is a fantastic filter for removing glare off the water, as I showed earlier. Also, a lot of times people don't realize that when you look into a forest, and especially after a rain, everything's dark green, but there's a lot of reflective light coming off that water on wet leaves and rocks. And a circular polarizer is fantastic to take that glare off of interesting areas in your composition. And I think that's hard to do any way else other than with a circular polarizer. So for me, there's always going to be one of these in my bag. So the ND filter, like I mentioned earlier, there are ways to get around this in camera. There are ways to get around it in Photoshop, taking multiple exposures and blending them together. You can also increase, as I mentioned earlier, you can stop down that lens and slow motion of water that way. So there's definitely ways to do it, and you don't necessarily need the filter. Now, are filters, are they obsolete? No, and I think filters are part of the creative process. It's like I mentioned with Ansel Adams. I mean, it's all about It's all about the photographer and their creative process and how they choose to capture their vision, their image. Now the graduated neutral density filter, this is a pretty easy one to replicate in Photoshop or Lightroom. Just with many filters that Lightroom has, makes this very easy. And if you've captured the exposure without blowing out the highlights, you can typically bring back the highlights in the image and come away with a pretty good image. But honestly, for me, I prefer, if I can, to capture it in camera. And that's just something that, for me, I think is important. So if you're on a budget, and like I mentioned earlier, and you just don't want to spend money on filters, you could probably get away without it. But I would still have that circular polarizer, no doubt. So another reason that I use filters is, well, honestly, I enjoy the process. There's something about pulling that filter out of your bag, putting that on your camera, and capturing that image, that moment, that feeling, capturing the feel of the image. And I think that filters allow me to do that in the field. And I've mentioned many times that being in the field and being outdoors and landscape photography is basically an avenue to getting outdoors and enjoying nature. Well, look, I enjoy putting this filter on my camera and being creative with it and capturing that image that I'm seeing and capturing that moment, how I feel at the moment, at the scene, right there with my camera, rather than getting back to Photoshop and just kind of hoping that I can create that vision. So I try to do as much of it in camera as I absolutely can. But I don't think that filters are obsolete. And even if they are, well, they're not obsolete for me. So with that, I'd like to say something about the creative process. And I think, as I mentioned, it's up to the individual photographer and what their goals and ambitions are. But the creative process, landscape photography is art. And you're the artist. You decide what brush you want to use, truly. And whether that's in the field or whether that's in Photoshop, there's powerful brushes out there to use. But one thing I would say is, don't let others tell you that you're wasting money. If you feel that there's value in filters, then use filters. If you don't, then don't use them. You use Photoshop, use Lightroom. You can certainly, either way, it really depends on you as an individual photographer. I don't want to be told by others what's obsolete and what's not obsolete. I think that's your choice. You have to decide if filters are for you or not. But I tell you, there's certainly a place in the creative world for filters. So the pros and cons of filters I think are pretty important, and I think it's good to kind of recap and think about filters and what some of the pros and cons are. So just kind of want to read through some of these. But so the cons, as I see it, one, these filters are hard resin or glass, and when you drop them, and I know because I dropped a 6-stop filter, ND filter, and they shatter. So that's not not ideal. So they do break. They're big, they're bulky, they're heavy. I've got to carry these things around in my bag. I hike with them. I might scale down and only take a few filters, but I don't, typically take them all. But you might do that. So you got to think about that too. Certainly the Nikon 14 to 24 requires larger filters, and these are 150 millimeters by 150 millimeters. And I think these graduated filters are 150 by 170. So yeah, they're pretty big. They take up space in your bag, and that's less stuff that you can carry, certainly if you're backpacking. And you may require varying strengths, and as I mentioned, there's hard grads, medium grads, soft grads, and you might find that you want all three of those, so that's even more filters to carry. They are expensive, and they can be. There's cheaper versions of filters out there. I like leaf filters. I think it's a good compromise between price and good quality. And you can't use them in every situation. The grad filter, I was out shooting earlier, and I've got a big subject right here, and it doesn't work out too well. So sometimes you just can't use them in every situation. And typically you got to correct for color cast, and certainly on the 10 stop, or the 6, but it's definitely, well, I almost broke it right there. The 10 stop, yeah. There's a color cast in your image. It's no big deal to take out though. Adjust a little white balance and tint, and you really get it comes out fine. So I don't really see that as a big deal, but it is a con. And they are a destructive workflow. So that's just something to keep in mind. Once you're in the field and you bake this into the image, and I mentioned before I don't do baked in images. I should have said with the exception of filters, because I really try to get it right in camera. But you can take 2 exposures. You can capture one without. You can bracket. Bracketing is another reason why a lot of people don't use filters, because they just bracket their images, taking multiple exposures and blending them together in Photoshop. So you really don't need that graduated neutral density filter. But there's a difference in capturing 4 or 2, 3 images or 1. And sometimes if you can get that exposure right, you only have to capture 1 image. So that's just something to think about. But I'm getting off topic here. So they are a destructive workflow in Photoshop or Lightroom. Once you bake this in, there's no getting it out. You can try to lighten it up with other filters, kind of counteract it, but yeah. Now the pros of the filters. So they can eliminate the need for bracketing, as I mentioned earlier. So instead of taking 2 or 3 images and blending them in Photoshop and dealing with artifacts and motion blur of leaves, you can just pop a filter in there and capture an image, and you don't have to deal with all that. Saves time in post-processing. That's another benefit. You don't necessarily need Photoshop or Lightroom. You can shoot JPEGs, and if you're not interested in the big post-processing process, then you can do that too. Looks great when it's done right and under optimal conditions, and reduces ghosting and artifacts, as I mentioned earlier. And as I talked about the creative process, you're creating the image in camera versus back in Photoshop. So you're kind of capturing the vision of the image in the field rather than trying to make it happen in Photoshop. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Well, I hope I was able to answer some of your questions and concerns, but more importantly, I hope I was able to answer why you want to use ND filters for landscape photography. And I guess really it comes down to the creative process. It comes down to the individual photographer, the individual artist, and it's really up to you whether you want to use filters, whether you want to capture your vision in the field, or whether you want to come back to in post-processing and kind of really paint it in there. I think either way it's not wrong. And I would not say that you're wasting money on filters. I think you're wasting your time and energy if you're not doing it the way that you want to do it. So it's really up to you. Well, anyway, I'm going to go ahead and end the video, but if you like the video, make sure you hit that like button and consider subscribing. And drop me a comment. Let me know what you thought. And as always, if I don't see you down the road, maybe I'll see you on the trail.